What if the key to protecting your brain from Alzheimer's isn't a pill, a diet, or even exercise, but in something you do every day? New research has uncovered a surprising link between specific jobs and a lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. But what's the connection? I think most people have either heard of or know someone who Alzheimer's disease has impacted. This complex disease is the most common cause of dementia, and it is characterized by the progressive brain changes that result in a gradual decline in memory, thinking, and reasoning skills. Approximately 60 million people are living with dementia worldwide, with experts predicting this figure to increase twofold by the year 2050. Unfortunately, deaths caused by Alzheimer's disease have doubled over the past 3 decades, and this rise will likely continue further as the population ages. But despite immense efforts from researchers and pharmaceutical companies worldwide, relatively few effective drugs are available to treat the disease. But what about prevention? Are there things that we can do, that we can control, to maybe reduce our likelihood of suffering from this horrible disease? Getting plenty of physical exercise and enjoying a healthy diet are classic examples that have been frequently associated with lowering your Alzheimer's disease risk. But what about other things? Maybe like your job. Researchers in the US looked at death records from a database containing nearly 9 million people. Specifically, they noted how each person died according to their official death certificate, as well as the occupation that they spent doing for most of their working life. These researchers wanted to see if some jobs were linked to lower Alzheimer's mortality rates. And out of 443 occupations included in their analysis, two in particular stood out: taxi drivers and ambulance drivers. These professions had significantly lower rates of Alzheimer's related deaths compared with other occupations, with a similar mean age at death. Even when adjusting for factors including sex and race, the pattern remained the same. Taxi drivers and ambulance drivers had a lower risk of Alzheimer's related deaths. To put this into perspective, the adjusted Alzheimer's mortality rate for ambulance drivers was just 0.74%, compared to 1.69% in the general population. That is less than half. Interestingly, the pattern of lower Alzheimer's disease mortality was not observed in other occupations related to transportation with fewer navigational demands, including bus drivers, aircraft pilots, and ship captains. But what does all this mean? What makes taxi and ambulance drivers so special? And why are other types of drivers, like bus drivers, not falling in the same bracket? Now, before you start rethinking your career path and applying to become an Uber driver, let's dig a little deeper to answer some of these questions. In our brains, there is a relatively small structure called the hippocampus, which is shaped like a seahorse. Despite its size, the hippocampus has a big job. It helps develop your learning and memory. A special type of memory associated with the hippocampus is spatial memory, or navigation. This ability helps you remember where you parked your car so you can return to it after a spot of shopping. And it is this spatial navigation that taxi drivers and ambulance drivers commonly use on a daily basis. So you can imagine that these drivers are not just following a set route, they're actively planning and adapting and solving problems in real time. That is, unless they're using a sat nav. Now, more on that later. Their jobs require them to train and memorize thousands of roads around the city to ensure they get to their destination in the most efficient route possible. They are constantly thinking and adapting their spatial navigation, essentially working their hippocampus hard. And what's the effect that this has? Well, at the start of the millennium, a different team of scientists in England performed MRI brain scans on London taxi drivers. They discovered that taxi drivers had a greater grey matter volume in some regions of their hippocampi compared with bus drivers. The brains of the taxi drivers are essentially physically changing in response to the spatial demands they face during their everyday job. Now, this isn't like bus drivers who are driving the same routes every day in, day out, and they're not really working their hippocampus as hard as taxi drivers. But how does this all relate to Alzheimer's disease risk? During the very early stages of Alzheimer's disease, it's the hippocampus that is heavily targeted. This results in a rapid loss of tissue and disruption of normal functioning with other vital parts of the brain. It is known that patients who later go on to develop Alzheimer's disease have a greater reduction in their hippocampal volume compared with those who do not develop the disease. So, linking back to taxi and ambulance drivers, assuming they have larger hippocampi compared with the general population, maybe this provides some protection against Alzheimer's disease. But before we declare spatial navigation the ultimate brain hack to preventing Alzheimer's disease, there are just a few caveats that the researchers quite rightly disclose in their analysis that are worth just touching on here. Firstly, this study does not prove causation, it's simply a correlation. However, the results are so interesting that it does indeed cry out for further investigations to understand this more. Secondly, there could just be some selection bias at play. Quite rightly, the individuals who are at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease may be less likely to enter or remain in memory intensive driving occupations, such as taxi and ambulance driving. I also think it's worth speculating about the potential role or hindrance of GPS technology here. Suppose we say intense driving occupations could potentially benefit people and lower their risk of Alzheimer's disease. But what happens when you add a sat-nav or a GPS technology to the mix? Many drivers today, including myself, rely on navigational apps, which might reduce the mental demands of the job. So it's worth asking, will the protective effect of navigational jobs fade in a world where technology does the thinking for us? Interestingly, some initial insights suggest that the frequent use of GPS technology can indeed reduce the function of the hippocampus and hippocampal dependent spatial memory. So the next time you drive somewhere new, maybe it's worth ditching those GPS apps and stick to a good old printed map to give your hippocampus a healthy workout. And what does all this research mean for the rest of us? Most people don't navigate the city streets for a living, but that doesn't mean we can't benefit from a little hippocampal exercise. Activities like hiking in unfamiliar areas, solving spatial puzzles, or even playing video games that require navigation could, in theory, give your brain a similar workout. Finally, all of this offers a fascinating glimpse into the hidden connections between our jobs, brains, and health. It's a reminder that the things we do every day, things we might even take for granted, can have a profound effect on our well-being.